Hello, Ancient Warfare fans, and welcome to Unit 13, where we will talk about the destruction of Jerusalem from the point of view not of the Romans this time, but rather from someone who experienced being conquered by the Romans, made some choices in the face of equally depressing options, and lived with the consequences. One of the reasons why we're reading Josephus is to get a bit of an outsider perspective, such as it is, on Roman power and Roman conquest. But also, this is a military incident that continues to affect international relations to this day, because this is a siege that culminates in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and also the mass deportation of Jewish people from Judea. I'm not going to spell it out any more than that, nor am I going to get into the issues involved there. Suffice to say, this is a really important moment in warfare history, and it's also a really good time to check in on how the Roman army functioned in the field and what that did to the political situation in the empire as well. Meet the Emperor Nero. He came to power as a teenager in 54 CE, and because of his youth, his mother acted as a regent along with his tutors for the first few years. Now, I'm not going to get into too much Nero facts because there are a lot, but Google him if you're interested, because he's very interesting. Certainly not the world's most popular emperor, due in part to the events that we're going to go through in this lecture and reading. This is not just a war of Romans against the people of Judea. This is a war layered onto a civil war. So there's a military coup going on, and there's an attempt to put down an uprising in Judea. So why is there an uprising in Judea, you may ask? Read on, or look on, watch on. Here, we're looking at a map of the Roman Empire in 69 AD or CE. This is possibly the easiest date to remember in history ever. This is the year when Rome's military machine blew up in its face again. So Nero was deposed by he became Emperor Galba. Galba was a general currently in charge of the legions in one of the provinces of Spain. So,
I'm a little boy.
I see, yes. So when he marched on Rome and got Nero to kill himself in a rather ironic move, Nero was infamous for forcing his political enemies to kill themselves. So I'm not particularly sad about Nero going the same way. But this kicked off a chain reaction, because other generals watching this were like, I've got legions, and I'm just as not related to the dynasty as Galba is. So almost immediately, Otho, the general managing the legions right next to Galba, marches on Rome, and on January 15th of 69 CE, he yoinks the empire from Galba, but he doesn't get to keep it for long. You'll notice by April, Vitellius has marched on Rome with his legions. The Gallic legions, because they held down the Rhine border and also Britain, were much more seasoned veterans than were the Spanish legions. So they saw the Spanish legions plot military coups, and they're like, we could take the Spanish legions. So Vitellius and his men march on Rome. On December 21st, you'll notice Vitellius managed to hold power for more months than Otho, so that's good. Yeah. Vespasian, yet another one of these generals, got his legions to march on Rome. His legions were stationed in the areas shown in blue. So he had been in charge of the legions of the Danube, and then when he fell asleep at a Nero concert and got himself exiled, sort of soft exiled, the emperor decided to send him to the most irritating and difficult to manage province he could think of, which was Judea. This also meant that Vespasian had the most seasoned and battle-ready troops in the empire at his disposal, and he plots the fourth and final military coup of 69 CE, thus holding the throne. But the Year of the Four Emperors made it really clear that imperial power was just about as stable as military leadership was, and that the emperor really had to be serious about keeping the military on side and cooperative. This is always the case, but particularly in Rome, where generals had so much authority and loyalty in the field. Yes, little man. So keep this map for your reference as you're watching the documentary. This will give you an idea of where people are and what's going on the world stage while stuff is going down in Judea. So here's the Year of Four Emperors plotted out with their busts, in case you wanted to know what these folks look like. Here they are, from Galba up here at the top, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian. Now, Vespasian manages to stay in power for 10 years, and he passes his power down to his sons, first the oldest and then the youngest. So this is a successful coup in that it successfully starts a dynasty. The dynasty lasts into the 90s, so a couple of decades, not a bad run. And here's the dynasty itself. Right. So Domitian is deposed in 96. So 69 to 96. At the end of Domitian's reign, there's another military coup, and then you have another dynasty takeover. This is going to be a bit of a pattern. Eventually it causes a crisis in the 3rd century, where like every 5 minutes there's a new emperor and there are all these splinter kingdoms. It's the whole thing. Now, as I mentioned, Vespasian had been in charge of Judea right before 69 CE goes down, and his power and ability to hold on to it hinges on what's going on in theater in Judea. Because Vespasian is not just putting down an uprising in Judea in order to stabilize the empire, but also in order to prove his ascendancy. If you're the new emperor, but the war you were in charge of when you did your military coup fails, you're going to look weak and other people are going to be coming for you. So what this geopolitical situation means is that Vespasian is hard-pressed to win a victory that is decisive enough to keep him and his family in power and other generals away from Rome. So let's see how he does this. If it makes you feel any better, Titus, you'll notice, was emperor for only 2 years. In the year 79 CE, you may recognize this if you're familiar with a certain volcano in the Bay of Naples. 79 CE, Vesuvius erupts. 80 CE, there's a plague and a fire in Rome. 81 CE, Titus drops dead. So if you find this a difficult conflict to sit with, maybe that'll make you feel better. I don't know, there's so few consolations in history. Meet our author for this section. This is Titus Flavius Josephus, at least that's his Roman citizen name. His name that he was born with in his native language, Hebrew and Aramaic too, he would have spoken, is YOSEF ben MATITYAHU. Excuse me for a minute. Could you take... So he's from an aristocratic family of the Levites. So he's priestly, and his relatives would have been involved in running the religious infrastructure in Judea, including officials in the temple at Jerusalem. He starts this war as a freedom fighter on the Jewish side of rebellion against Rome. Then he's taken hostage, is briefly enslaved, and then becomes a collaborator with the Romans. He acts as a translator and a go-between. The moment when this happens is at the seat of Yodfat, which is in the documentary, so I'm not going to rehash what goes on there. But it's a story that makes Josephus a difficult and polarizing character in the Jewish community. So all Jewish people weren't living in Judea in the ancient Mediterranean, far from it. Jewish communities were spread out across the entire Mediterranean basin. The largest community of Jewish people outside of Judea was in Alexandria, Egypt. After that, though, the city of Rome. The city of Rome had not only a large number of immigrant Jews, but also Jewish converts. This was a period in the history of Judaism when proselytism, so the attempt to convince people to join your religion, was still being practiced on a large scale. This is not the case in most Jewish communities today. So for people living in the greater Mediterranean Jewish community, Josephus would seem to be either a champion of Jewish inclusion in the Roman Empire, which a lot of people were down for, or a traitor who had turned against the cause of Judea, who had had a hand in the destruction of the temple, and had essentially turned on his own people in order to save his life and get profit. In his behalf, though, I think it's necessary and fair to point out that Josephus was in a very difficult position. None of us know what we're going to do when our back is up against the wall and we have to choose to either not die and collaborate with Romans, or to turn on our own people, collaborate with the Romans, but save our lives, members of our family's lives. And it's not that simple either. Josephus hoped that he could save lives of people in his community. I have a complicated relationship with this guy myself. A generous interpretation of his position, though, would say that he acknowledged the unlikelihood of a victorious rebellion, especially once Vespasian becomes emperor. Any kind of successful long-term revolt is pretty much off the table here. So he's trying desperately to achieve some kind of survival for his people. And none of us know how we would react to this situation. Like, unless you yourself have been in a hostile takeover of your own country and forced to choose between a variety of bad choices, I don't think we get to be too judgy. But I'm also not giving Josephus a free pass here. His choices during this conflict led to not only a conflicted relationship with modern historians and the modern Jewish community, but also with the Jewish community in antiquity as well. So he, as a collaborator with the family of the new emperor, was given citizenship through that family. So that's why his name Titus Flavius, that Flavius, is a name taken from the Flavian dynasty. So his sponsor for citizenship was Titus Flavius Vespasianus. So he's Titus Flavius Josephus, which is what you do when you've been enslaved and then granted freedom and citizenship. Now, Titus, who eventually ends up being emperor, tries to set Josephus up with a number of Jewish women as wives. I think there are 3 of these attempts. All of the relationships fail. Josephus, to all indications, dies sad and a little bit alone. So this is not a situation where he wins. But what he does have time and sponsorship to do is to write. And he writes a history of the Jewish people that's still a very important source for historians of Judaism. But he also writes an account of the war he was a part of. In that way, he's a lot like Polybius. So Polybius is writing in part about Roman actions against Greek-speaking peoples, when Polybius himself is a Greek hostage and prisoner of war living in the Scipio household. Josephus is a prisoner of war and hostage living in the household of the Roman emperor, and he's writing a history of his people with an eye towards pleasing his new imperial bosses. It's a complicated situation to be in. It's not an uncomplicated source to get a counter-narrative about Roman power from. Josephus has to, for various reasons, speak sympathetically about his now bosses. But he also does write very frankly about what it's like to be invaded by the Romans. And part of why I have you read the beginning passages about the fall of Jerusalem is because he includes some details that we haven't seen in other historians about the physical experience of being in a siege, the smell of blood, old and new, the panic and the claustrophobia of being caught up in a besieged city, the anxiety and increasing desperation as you're trying to decide how to resolve the ongoing siege conflict, even as you're watching people die around you. I think it's fair to warn you also there's a particularly distressing incident about a starving mother and her child. It gets pretty bad, so kind of when you see a mom show up, brace yourself, because that's hard, very hard reading. Josephus also wrote philosophy too. As an educated man of the priestly caste, he'd had a full Greek philosophical education, as was typical for upper-class people in both Rome and Judea. So that's Josephus. On to the Great Revolt, the uprising from 66 to 70 CE. This is the very, very fast version of why the Jewish people decided to revolt. And it's primarily to do with taxation, although also religious freedom. This conflict is one that we see repeated across the empire due to the tax-raising apparatus of the Roman state. Romans would subcontract tax collection in the provinces out to firms who would bid, not for the lowest bid, but rather whoever could promise the highest tax revenue. However, if you collected more taxes than you'd promised to the state, you only have to pay the tax that you promised. So you get to pocket the difference. So if you promise the Romans, hey, we'll raise 70 million sesterces, and then you actually collect 100 million, then you get to keep the difference. You only owe Rome the 60 million. So it's a good deal. What this means on the ground, though, is that the people collecting taxes are incentivized to overdo it. And this is causing massive economic collapse, poverty, suffering, and resentment all across the empire. This is, however, exacerbated in Judea, where there is a sharp religious difference between the Roman occupation and the local belief system, because Judaism is a monotheistic religion. So Judaism only has one God, and there's also a belief that this God is exclusionary. So you can't worship the God of Judaism and other gods as well. Some people did, but you weren't supposed to. And this was something that the people of Judea had revolted over before under Greek rule. Romans had an uneasy relationship with Jewish religious freedom, due in part to the growing influence of the imperial cult. So the emperors began, as emperors had in the past in this course, to rely on religious machinery in order to cement their power. They started by deifying or making into gods emperors who had died. So when Julius Caesar dies, he's made into a god. When Augustus dies, he's made into a god. Not all of the emperors in this dynasty get to be gods, but a lot of them do. This meant that if you weren't willing to pray to and make sacrifices to the dead emperor, it would be seen as a sign of disloyalty. It was a break in the ceremony of patriotism. And this led many Romans to get a little bit confused and to think of Jewish people as atheists, not because Jewish people didn't have a god, but because they weren't willing to adopt extra gods. So atheism means something a little different for people in the ancient world. Right. So we come to the revolt then. In the years leading up to it, some emperors had started to deify themselves in the provinces when they weren't dead yet. And some had even gone so far as to try to make themselves a god across the empire during their lifetime, which is understandable. Like, it's more fun to be a god when you're alive, I guess. And this led to some real problems in Judea. For instance, the Emperor Gaius had at one point ordered that a statue of himself be put into the temple at Jerusalem and worshipped with the sacrifice of a pig. If you know anything about Judaism at all, you know how objectionable this would be to a Jewish person. Not only do you not worship other gods in Judaism, but you also don't worship them in the temple. There's only one god and one temple, and it's in Jerusalem during this period. But you don't sacrifice a pig, which in Judaism is an unclean animal. You can't eat it. Its blood is considered unclean. So that animal in that place sacrificed to that god is egregiously inappropriate. And inappropriate is a mild word for it. It's something that Jewish people found utterly unacceptable and something that would make war compulsory for many, but not all Jewish people. As in any situation, there was a variety of responses to this political reality. Some people were like, let's just humor the Romans, and the statue isn't real, he's not really a god, so other people were like, look, let's come up with a compromise where, like, non-Jewish people can worship him somewhere else, but, like, we keep the temple. So that was going on at the same time as this next incident fires off. Nero, by the way, was also starting to go the I'm a living God route, and Jewish communities across the Mediterranean were getting really nervous about it. So this incident, briefly put, the procurator, the Roman governor in Jerusalem, wanted to collect still more taxes than were even owed. And he threatens to go to the temple in Jerusalem and take the gold out of it to cover the tax revenue. And there was a peaceful protest in the city of Jerusalem that started up in response to this, where people would come up to poor Procurator Florus and give him spare change, kind of like, oh, if you're that hard up for money, here's 50 cents, go buy yourself a sandwich. Procurator Florus didn't take this well. He started executing people for participating in this peaceful protest. That is what sparked off the revolt. So I won't go into too many details. This is in the docudrama. I will mention, though, that this is not a unified resistance. There are a bunch of different factions who are all at the same time revolting with varying degrees of cooperation amongst themselves. Some of them are also minting their own coinage. The elements of this rebellion who end up in the city of Jerusalem on Passover for the siege include the Zealots of Eleazar, which seems to be a mostly political movement based on trying to get Jewish sovereignty and reestablish a Jewish free kingdom. John of Gischala was a mercenary captain who starts working for a religious faction, but later they kill their religious overlords and take over themselves. And there's also a messianic movement under the Simon Bar Giora person. So the Zealots of Eleazar and Simon ben Giora are both minting coinage, and here are some examples of those coins. So because there are all of these conflicting and mutually competing resistance groups in Judea, it's not at all certain who would get to be in charge if the Romans are gotten rid of. And this also really hobbles the ability of the Jewish uprising to effectively make use of the weakness of the Roman government to gain independence. Because towards the end of this revolt, so the years 68 and 69, these are the exact same years when military coups are popping off in the city of Rome. Excuse me for a second. Okie dokie. So now we're in a quiet room. What else was I going to say? No, that's it for this slide. Okay, so here we are in my son's room. Go. Where is your dad? Okay. So here we are in the city of Jerusalem from overhead. So you can see the wall structures. Don't pay attention to the route. This is taken from a tourist map. This includes a reconstruction of what the Temple Mount would have looked like in 70 CE. Now, these are all guesses as to where the footprints of these buildings go. The important ones to point out, here is the Antonia. So this is a heavily fortified... No, baby. This is a heavily fortified... Bye-bye. Heavily fortified gate and meant to protect the temple itself. So just like other ancient cities, at the top of the mountain you have your holiest sites and your fancy temples. As you move away from the highest point of the city, you also have sub-walls that are built to defend urban sprawl as the city expanded. So here's another Jim, not right now. This is another topographical map showing the various areas in which the fighting takes place. Beginning in Bezeta, so right in through here, this is the first gate that the Romans besiege. Here's the Antonia, so this is the fortress where the heaviest fighting has to take place, because here's where the fortifications are the heaviest. And then this is the old town where Simon Bar Giora makes his final stand. So this might be a good diagram to keep next to you while you're watching the documentary. And I've got this labeled with each party where they are. This siege takes place during the Passover, which is a particularly sadistic move on Titus's part. But keep in mind, he's under a lot of pressure to finish this rebellion up quickly so that it can support his father's recently acquired emperorship. So he comes when he knows that Jerusalem is going to be full of religious pilgrims and overcrowding is going to be a massive issue. And by locking down the city at this point, he's going to accelerate the starvation inside the city proper. So that's the source of the desperation that we see happening in this particular siege scenario. And that's also why nobody has enough food to support their factions. Also, factions plural is a problem. There are way too many cooks in this kitchen. There have been a few innovations in Roman siege warfare since we last checked in with artillery in the Hellenistic period. So let me introduce you to some of these bad boys. These are all of the siege crafts that are used at the Siege of Jerusalem, including earthenwork ramps. So this isn't the first time we've seen a ramp. At the Siege of Plataea, they're using earthenwork ramps to try to get around the walls. But in the Jewish wars, Romans really go all in for this. First at Jerusalem and later at Masada. You can still see the Roman ramp at Masada. Wait for it, it's on the last slide. Now, some of these bits of equipment are familiar faces that haven't changed a lot since the Hellenistic period, except in small little innovations that make them more accurate and more sturdy. So for instance, we still have tortoise rams, like the one that you see here at the top. Similarly, siege towers are still very much a thing. More about them in a minute. We have new in this army the Onager and the catapult, which are very similar machines. I'm not going to differentiate between them. I'm just going to talk about the Onager a bit. The difference between a catapult and an Onager has to do with the way the rock is held. So the catapult just has a little cup for the rock that it's hurling. The onager has a rock that's in a sling base, and that adds slinging force onto the already substantial force coming off of the arm. More about that in a minute. We also have the souped up latest version of the auxibiles, the ballista. So the ballista is longer, bigger, stronger, with more poundage, but the essentials haven't really changed since the last iteration of the auxibiles that we looked at. There's still a ratcheting mechanism to pull back the string. The arms are still on torsion mounts. So this is a classic for a reason. See, anything else I want to say? Nope, that about covers that. So here we are looking at the onager. So the onager combines all of the throwing force of a sling with the torsion force of an arm. So the torsion assembly here is something that should be familiar to you from the auxibiles and the lithobolos back in the Hellenistic lecture. We have twisted strings around an arm, and there's also a crank and ratchet mechanism here to pull the arm back. Switch, no, do this in blue. The trigger mechanism is here. When you pull on this cord, you remove this bronze catch from around the arm, releasing it to fly up and impact here on the cross brace. So when the arm is stopped as it moves in this kind of a motion, then the top part of the sling, so the bottom of the sling is attached firmly to the arm, but the top is just held on to a little peg, so that when this arm stops, the rock is going to continue to move in a parabolic arc, and then it's going to smash with maximum force into the enemy wall. So this is a wall-breaking device. The idea is to cause large cracks in the masonry facing of the enemy's walls. And when those cracks appear, the loose fill that is between the outer layers of the wall is going to burst through, and then the wall is going to collapse into the breach between. So pretty clever. But the walls of Jerusalem were built to withstand days, weeks, months of pounding from machinery like this. It takes more to bring them down, without any spoilers, but it's a key plot point in the docudrama. Here is another innovation, although we've seen the ancestor of this before. So when we last saw the siege tower, it was as the Helepolis, and that's still what this is doing. But at the siege of Jerusalem, the Romans use an innovation on this model, where they mount a battering ram onto the siege tower itself and use the siege tower as a base for hammering directly on the wall. So if you see here, there are ropes suspended from either side of the battering ram here that's going through the body of the siege tower, and then it's swinging not at the gate down here, but rather at the wall here in order to break off the tops of the ramparts. So this is pretty clever, but the Romans take it one step farther. By using two siege towers and attaching the battering ram to a pole between the two. And this is what the Romans do in an attempt to break through the doors of the Antonia. Without very good results, I might add. Eventually, they have to rely on a fortuitous collapse caused by undermining from the Jewish side of the defenses. And the documentary goes into this well enough. I don't think I need to explain it in any greater detail. It's an interesting moment, though. So, thus ends the siege of Jerusalem. Men of fighting age are killed off, except for the ones that are sent to Rome to fight as gladiators or to work as manual laborers. But everyone is enslaved, men, women, children, everyone. Children who are too young to be usefully enslaved are also killed. So this is a particularly gruesome end to this uprising. Not unusually violent for Rome, though. Rome maintains control in part due to extreme measures applied when there is a revolt, and this was meant to be a deterrent. But Vespasian has even more reason to be harsh on his newly defeated province, because this is the example he's going to use to convince every other general in the Roman world not to foment a military coup. And it's the one safe way he can do this, because it was considered super tacky for one Roman to brag about defeating another Roman. You're not supposed to do that. But bragging about defeating non-Romans, especially people who had engaged in an insurrection against Roman rule, that you could do. And that's what Vespasian runs with. So as I said, he enslaves as many people as he can get a hold of and ships them off to Rome to act as imperial workforce folks. So they work on the many construction projects that we're about to look at. But then also on all of his coinage, he puts front and center the captured, victory in Judea. So these are two of the Judea Copta coins. So they say Judea here is Latin for Judea, and Copta means has been captured. So all of these coins, every time you pay with this coin with Vespasian's face, which here he is, it's Vespasian's face, you're paying with a coin that reminds you that Judea has been captured, that a rebellion has been squashed. The scene shows a palm tree with a Jewish man, his hands tied behind his back because he's been captured. And then there's also a female figure. This is the personification of Judea, because Judea is a feminine word. The personification of the country was female, also because women were considered natural victims in a warfare situation, showing Judea as a woman who is weeping because her family is dead and she's about to be enslaved is a visual language reminding you what will happen to you and your country if you rebel against Vespasian. Similarly, on this coin, we have an even less subtle image of Roman triumph. At the top, you have the armor of the soldier who is kneeling on the ground with his hands tied behind his back. This would have been one of the things you'd have seen at Titus's triumph. So Titus was awarded a triumph at the end of the siege in Judea, a triumph that Josephus would have, we know that he attended it because he tells us he was there. So Josephus would have seen some of his own relatives being paraded through the streets as part of this triumph. And this is what you would look like if you were in the triumph. So your hands would be bound behind you and your armor would be put up as spoils, as captured trophies with all of your weapons on this little armature thing. Very unsubtle. This, by the way, let's see, is Vespasianus. Yeah, I think this coin shows Titus, the son of the emperor, rather than the emperor himself. So Vespasian, the father, is out of the picture when Titus wins his victory, but Titus is a future emperor. This is one of several building projects that you may be forced as labor to construct if you were at the siege of Jerusalem and managed to live through the starvation and the kidnapping and being trafficked. That is the Forum of Vespasian. A forum was a marketplace and also a set of government buildings. So it's a little bit like a combination between a shopping mall and a courthouse, with a religious space too. So at the very back of the forum, so the court spaces would have been here. There's often a public library. There might be some shops here and here. This was a public park. And then at the back, you had a temple. This particular temple was dedicated to the goddess of peace, the personification of peace. More about peace in my wrap-up lecture here. It may comfort you to know that all that's left of this temple of peace is this. This is a little bit of the concrete foundations that would have gone under the cult statue. So there's even less left of this temple than there is left of the temple in Jerusalem. So yay. There is no yay here. This is just all awful. Now, inside this Temple of Peace, I mentioned that this would have been an art gallery and a display place. What was displayed in this temple were the spoils taken from the Holy of Holies in the Temple at Jerusalem. So the sacred menorah, the various holy objects that would have been kept back behind the veil. The veiling itself would have been there had the temple not been set on fire. And then also the most wealthy artifacts taken from the rich people of Jerusalem. So the most holy relics of the Jewish religion would have been housed here in a temple to a god that Jewish people don't worship because it's not the god of Judaism. This is a really insulting move here. And when Romans dedicate this to peace, they're not being ironic or anything. Roman peace means something a little bit different to them than does our sense of peace. Peace is a lack of rebellion. It's a state wherein nobody is in a position to attack us ever again. It's the peace of the sword. So even for Romans who have a concept of peace, it's not decoupled in any particular way from violence. They're very intimately and closely related. So here's the Arch of Titus. You've seen it before in the context of Roman triumphs, and this was an arch built for this particular triumph, but it's not the only arch built for this triumph. However, let's have a look at the relief carvings before we move on to the other Arch of Titus. On the inside, so as you're going under this arch, what you have to do, because it's on the main drag through the Roman Forum, the Via Sacra, you see Titus himself in his chariot with the goddess of victory behind him holding his wreath. In the actual triumph, it would have been the enslaved person, but here it's the goddess of victory because it's propaganda. His victorious soldiers are marching here with all of their stuff. On the other side, you have the part of the parade carrying the holiest spoils from the temples with the placards telling you what this stuff is. So every time you walked under this arch, you would have seen the Romans in the act of carrying off the very items over which Judea had rebelled. Because keep in mind that the incident that sparks off this whole rebellion is over whether or not the Romans are allowed to take the holy stuff from your sacred temple. And the Romans are like, yes, we can. Permanently. Wow. Wow. So this is the other thing you might have been building. So if you are not enslaved to build the Forum of Vespasian or the Arch of Titus, you might be building the Flavian Amphitheater or the Colosseum. So this was built on the drained site of Nero's pleasure lake. He had an urban lake that he used for entertaining and parties and such. The lake was drained and the amphitheater built on top of it as a public monument for public entertainment. And the entire thing was built with labor captured in the fall of Judea. So when I look at the Colosseum, I actually don't find it cool. I find it disturbing and upsetting because you're looking at the product of enslaved labor. The hands who built it were the hands that had just been defeated in Jerusalem, and the first games held in this, the first people forced to fight to the death in front of an audience, were the men of fighting age that were left alive after the fall of Jerusalem. So you may have been forced to build this thing and then forced to fight another Jewish person to the death in front of a crowd of cheering Romans. That is messed up. That is deeply messed up to me, and I find it horribly distressing to think about. And that's okay. We sometimes have this idea that historians need to disengage their emotions at the door in order to encounter the past, and I don't think that's true at all, or even responsible or humane. Empathy is one of the best tools we have at our disposal for connecting to the past and understanding what it is that we're seeing. And it's even more important when we're empathizing with the people who don't have a voice. And for all that Josephus exists, and Josephus did have an experience that parallels the people forced to build the Colosseum up to a point, right? He was in the resistance. He did find Rome objectionable enough to fight against it. But at some point, he decided to cooperate with the Romans and had to live with that experience. But the people who didn't cooperate with the Romans also had a horrible experience. Nobody wins in the face of Roman domination, at least not in this round. But eventually, the Romans, as Romans, aren't really around anymore, so that's the thing, I guess. But yeah, the Flavian Amphitheater is a sad and bloody memorial to some really unpleasant things, and we forget that at our peril. So here we are looking at a map of Rome, all of it put together, where we have the Flavian Amphitheater. I'm going to draw this in blue. If you go out of the Flavian Amphitheater, down the main road past the Forum of Julius Caesar, you go through the Arch of Titus, that's what's on this red circle here, and then continue up the Sacred Way until you get to the Forum of Vespasian. So you are walking through the main sacred district of downtown Rome through 3 monuments to this war. 3 monuments to a war is excessive, even for Romans. And this is here for a purpose, because Vespasian never wants you to forget what he did to Judea, because Vespasian is afraid. I don't think Vespasian had a night of clear, comfortable sleep after he did what he did to gain the throne in Rome, because constantly in the back of his mind is the thought that another general is going to rebel and come after me, and my children are going to die as a result of my ambitious coup. And that's something to keep in mind too. When I say there are no winners, I mean the Romans too. I also mentioned there is another arch. That arch has only recently been found here at one of the entrances to the Circus Maximus. So the Circus Maximus was another place where games were held, in this case chariot racing, but also gladiatorial competitions were held here too. So this means that on the other end of town, take my blue line now the other way into the Forum, down the road and up to the circus, you have yet another monument to Vespasian's triumph. So what Vespasian has done is he's made it impossible to forget that Judea has been captured by Vespasian and his son Titus. He's put it on the coinage, he's put it on the landmarks, he's made it the centerpiece of his dynasty's existence. And that's why Judea in some ways is the wrong place in the wrong time. And the sad thing is that they were almost in the right place at the right time, because having a rebellion underway while Rome is in a state of instability is one of the few situations in which you could have successfully broken away from Roman control. I think we need to avoid casting blame on one party or another for why this was an unsuccessful rebellion. Things happen. And a lot of how warfare turns out is as much about luck as it is about good leadership. But certainly the fragmented leadership in the Jewish rebellion didn't necessarily help with the all-over goal. But it didn't necessarily hurt either, in the sense that once Jerusalem had fallen, the rebellion wasn't over yet. There were still groups independently operating with their own armies able to continue the resistance. And it's not until the siege of Masada, which we're about to look at, that we finally can declare a decisive put-down of this uprising. Here's a close-up, by the way, of the Flavian Amphitheater, the Sacred Road, and the Arch. I've pulled in a callback here from Tacitus Agricola. When the Romans make a devastation, they call it peace. Tacitus is writing his life of Agricola when the Flavian dynasty has just been put out of business. So it only lasts for the two sons, Vespasian, then Titus, and then Domitian, the little brother. Domitian is deposed, and Tacitus was not a fan of him at all. So when he puts into Calgacus's mouth this one-liner about how Romans make a mess, and that's what they call peace, that's what they try to pass off as peace, I'm sure Tacitus is thinking about this early moment in the Flavian dynasty where Jerusalem is made into a wasteland, buildings leveled, temples destroyed, people liquidated, and then peace is declared from the rooftops, quite literally in the case of the Forum of Vespasian. It's a pretty eloquent takedown, and one that I'm going to philosophize a little bit about in my wrap-up lecture. So I mentioned that we were going to look at the Siege of Masada, and here I am, good as my word. Masada started as a palace for the Herodian dynasty. So the palace itself was on the hilltop and some of the sides here, and it was a royal retreat because nobody could get at the king except for people who were authorized to get at the king. So it was a very logical place to hole up and make a base of operations for a long game resistance. So in 72 CE, so this is now 3 years after 69 CE when Vespasian takes power, and this is after the triumph in Rome as well. The hostilities are still ongoing, and this is the last moment of concerted resistance, although I should say not the last moment of resistance writ large. This continues to be an area where people contest Roman rule. Go them. So at the top, Masada, and you will notice here and also here, there are structures that look very much like a playing card with rounded off corners and two X-shaped roads intersecting at the middle. It's a castra. So this is the castra in which the legions making the final assault on Masada camped. You will also notice between the Roman encampment and the Jewish fort, here in this valley, there is what appears to be a sandbar. That's man-made. That's how the Romans got into Masada, is they built shovelful by shovelful an earthenworks ramp all the way up to the top of Masada. When they broke in, the defenders, seeing that the writing was on the wall and things were done, took their own lives to avoid capture. And that's how this particular uprising ends, with massive destruction on both sides, with some political bragging points for the Flavians, and a really complicated legacy for our author Josephus. And that's what I have for you specifically about the Jewish War. Stay tuned for my final remarks in the last video.